Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. This is an exciting time for us because for the first time since March, the city is going to allow indoor dining on September 8th, which means you all have a ton of questions that Palak is here to try and answer for you. We're going to allow her to go through the presentation, and then we will have time at the end for questions. We're asking everybody to remain muted. If you have questions, please put them in the chat box, and I will ask Palak at the conclusion of her presentation. As a reminder, this webinar is for PRLA members or or restaurants or hotels or anybody in the hospitality industry. If you are a member of the media or part of the media, we ask that you please disconnect now. We're always available to answer questions or provide comments later, and this webinar will be recorded. But if you are a member of the media, we ask you that you disconnect at this time. And with that, Palak, you're quite the draw. We have 103 people and counting on here, so I will turn it over to you to go over everything they need to know, and of course we'll have questions at the end. Thank you.
That sounds great. So hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to be a part of this. As I've mentioned from early on, most of you, I've been working with you for over 24 years, and I look forward to this opportunity to continue to work with you all while we are going through this adjustment process. And as we move forward to opening up indoors. So I wanted to go ahead and just go through a handful of slides, and then there's also a YouTube video that was put together that is available. The link is available on the health department's page so that you know what needs to be set up and how it needs to be set up. And then we can move forward. I will say that I'll be taking notes, so if there are questions that I need to ask of the health commissioner or other facets of city government, I will do my best to get those questions answered and respond back through Melissa. Okay, so next slide, please. So again, masks and facial covering are a requirement, and we can both for your patrons as well as for your staff. And one of the nuances or things that have changed is that your wait staff will be required to have face shields as well as masks. The reason being is that we will be indoors dining, and the patrons will not have face coverings or masks on while they're eating and drinking. So for the safety of your wait staff, they need to have face shields and masks. Also, if there are face shields and masks, and if you can hold on the slide for just 1 second, if you provide face shields for your kitchen staff, that will also assist with any challenges that you may have in terms of creating barriers or spaces dedicated for the kitchen staff. I know one of the folks had reached out to me and asked that question, but we'll go through the do's. So here's some do's. The next slide, please. So again, this is from the outdoor dining as well. The face mask covers both the nose and the mouth. Next, please. This is a picture of the face shield on top of the face mask, and this is from an actual establishment in the city. The video that we filmed is from a brand new establishment that's opening up that was moving towards indoor dining. So the face shields would go over the mask. Next, please. The don'ts are obviously, having the face mask, not covering the nose. This is a big thing. You want to make sure that both the mouth and the nose are covered, and you want to make sure the mask is being utilized properly. Next, please. And then this would be, a big don't where the server just shows up without anything. Okay. Next. Barriers. Again, we want you to have barriers in place at the pickup delivery areas, as well as any sort of cash register or hostess table. The next slide, we'll talk about, and these are do's. You can, if you don't have enough space at your establishment to spread out the tables, You can create barriers in between the tables. These are some examples how you can erect barriers. And again, the goal of the barrier is to prevent, if someone is sitting down or standing up, from being able to sneeze, cough, or do anything to the other side where the other patrons are sitting. Next, please. So the don'ts would be just having open air seating without any sort of barriers or anything in place, and tables very close to each other. Next, please. Isolate. This is really important. This is about, you know, your staff and yourself. If someone is presenting symptoms or is feeling sick, you should have an atmosphere where they can report that out, and you should also go ahead and make sure that you notify them to go ahead and quarantine if needed, and to seek medical treatment. Okay, so these are some examples of do's. You want to make sure that you have signage and that your staff are well aware of your COVID policies as well, specifically since folks are going to be indoors as well as outdoors. Next, please. Again, the do's, the don'ts would be not having anything, or having staff that are coughing and sneezing like this gentleman, and doing that in their hands without any sort of protection, and then holding food or food products in the other hand. Social distancing. Before we get to the pictures, I just want to reiterate that it's really important that the social distancing is 6 feet all the way around. Okay, so it's 6 feet all the way around, and it's very important that the tables and the staffing and everything is set up that way, including when patrons need to use the toileting facilities. There should be space for the patrons to go ahead and use the toileting facilities, but if they are waiting in line, you should minimize the number of people waiting in line for the toileting facilities, and you should also go ahead and ensure that there are social distancing markers on the floor. And some of this you may already have in place from your outdoor dining setup. Next, please. So this is an example of, and again, it's parties of 4 people, and this is because it's indoor, okay? So you need to limit the party size to 4 people, and the setting should be 6 feet apart. If your space can't have 6 feet apart, then you can erect barriers in between. Okay, so the don'ts would be having the tables still with 4 chairs, but everybody very close to each other, like in this picture example. Okay, reducing crowds. We know that COVID spreads when a lot of people are getting together and not masked and not socially distancing. And, you know, we don't want any situations in our city where we have to go in a different direction. We are moving forward with the reduction of number of cases and everything. So we want to keep moving forward on that trend. So we want to go ahead, and we need help from the restaurateurs to go ahead and you know, engage in crowd reduction practices. So next, please. So do's would be, don't have people waiting in line at the entryway. Make reservations. You want to be able to have the patron's phone number. If you don't have a space that's like, you don't have enough space to have people socially distanced lined up, you can say, listen, your reservation's for 7 p.m. If you get here earlier, or if we're running late, you may be asked to wait, you know, in your vehicle or somewhere off site, and then we'll have to call you via phone. Okay, next, please. And then this is an example of don't. These are actual pictures that we have seen in the field of people just lined up, you know, with nothing. Next, please. Hand washing. We know that the best way to deal with viruses and bacteria are proper hand washing, and we want to make sure that there is opportunity for the staff, the patrons, and everybody to adequately wash their hands. We know that using gloves in lieu of hand washing is not adequate. Hand sanitizer and hand wipes are great, but wherever possible, you want to encourage hand washing. Next slide. So the do's of hand washing are making sure that all staff are properly washing their hands and that the hand washing sinks are available and there's hot and cold running water and soap and paper towels, and the sinks are not blocked with anything, and you have adequate signage up to make sure that your staff are properly washing hands continuously. The don'ts would be to just not, let people wash hands or have the facilities to wash hands. Next, please. Cleaning. So as you have table service, and those of you that have been doing outdoor dining, you want to make sure that you're adequately sanitizing the table surfaces in between the diners. So it's really important that you go ahead and have a routine in place for sanitizing and cleaning the tables, and you want to mirror those practices to the inside. Okay, so an example would be to wipe down all the surfaces and sanitize the tabletops. Do not eliminate table presets. You don't want to do that. You want to minimize the number of items that are going to have to be special cleaned and everything. Don't preset the table. The menus, again, wherever possible, you want to use disposable menus or have menus just like you've been doing for outdoors. Have menus available inside that are digital or that can be disposed of after use. And there's a really good example of that in the YouTube video that I believe Melissa and they're going to put in the chat. Okay, next please. The don'ts would be to just, leave dirty tables and not adequately sanitize the tables in between. And remember, when you're sanitizing, you want to let the tables air dry for a little bit to make sure that the surface is actually, the sanitizing solution has the opportunity, or disinfecting solution has the opportunity to get rid of any prior germs, because your patrons will be sitting at this table without masks. So you want to make sure those folks that are cleaning it have proper personal protective equipment. Okay, so those are the don'ts. Next slide. You want to make sure that there's adequate communication, that you do provide signage for the staff that's very clear, that says, you need to maintain social distancing, have proper signage. And a lot of you have done this already for outdoor dining. So you just want to kind of increase the signage inside as well. And the don't would be to kind of have signs, that say face masks are not required, or not having any signage at all. Okay. And the other information is just that, the Title 46 and all the existing regulations still apply. And the COVID requirements and regulations from the state on down still apply. Next, please. And here's our general contact information and phone number. Okay.
Hey, Halleck, you move quickly. That's great because we have a lot of questions.
Yes, I saw those questions pop up, so.
I'm going to go through them. Before we start going through the questions, Commerce Department is on the call, and they would like to kind of get a feel for how many of you are planning to open for indoor dining, or if you're planning to wait. So if you could put down your restaurant and if you're planning to open indoors or not, I think that would be helpful for commerce. So if you could start putting that in the chat box, that would be helpful. I will only be asking questions that are applicable to the webinar today. Personal opinions always appreciated. It is a free country, but I want to utilize this time to get some questions answered while we're all on the call together today. So with that, our first question, Halleck, is for private events in restaurants, what are the limitations on people? Is it 25 people or a capacity restriction or something else?
So it is a capacity restriction, but again, It can be a combination of those things. I would rather evaluate that honestly on a case-by-case basis, because the rule of thumb is, some folks, yesterday I was on a conference, some folks were saying, listen, what if I take my foyer space and add tables there so I can increase capacity? So, I just want to make sure that we're mindful of that, and we try to be, as understanding of what the business is trying to do with the backdrop of proper regulation for COVID and proper regulation for any food safety issues.
Thank you. And then Palik, there's a question, if you could go over the 11 p.m. closure rule and maybe what that applies to and which scenario, and how that is working with the new regulations.
Sure, absolutely. So again, we want to make sure that we are creating safety measures in our city to kind of keep track of activity, and so that we can minimize as much exposure to COVID as possible. So with that said, dining indoor and outdoor, and we kind of mirrored it off of the requirements for when you're supposed to end your takeout service for alcohol. So basically it is the last call for all of this is 11 p.m. So while you're eating, you can, order your alcohol beverage, but your patrons at 11 p.m. finish that order. They would go ahead then and finish up their meal by midnight. And the goal is that the establishment can be done and completely cleaned up by 12:30 a.m.
Thank you. And to that end, Palik, I know there was some confusion since outdoor dining, if there was an extension, that closure was 10 p.m. Will that change under these new guidelines?
Yes, we are working on that. Yes, ma'am. So that it's 11 all the way through, and you can order your meal and your beverage and then finish up and be done. And the establishment is completely cleaned up and closed off by 12:30 a.m.
Thank you. If the register is away from the patrons, is it necessary to create a barrier around it?
No, it is not. If they're not going to be nobody is walking up to the register, or they can't walk up to the register, then you don't need to worry about a barrier.
Thank you. With the table of 4 set as a maximum, what if a family of 5 or 6 want to have a table together? Would that be permissible?
I would have to get back to you, but the rule right now is 4. So if you need to have a larger party, you can always set it up for outdoor seating. Outdoor seating is still 6. And again, this is contingent, the 4 is contingent on the ventilation issues within an indoor environment.
Thank you. And can a restaurant still offer a coat check for their guests?
They can operate a coat check with the caveat that there's a barrier at the window where the check-in is, and that, there's you minimize contact.
And could you speak a little bit, we've gotten a few questions on this. Philadelphia is a little bit different than other states and cities with a server needing to wear a mask and a face shield. So could you, one, speak to the logic that was put into that decision? And then we have a few follow-up questions regarding on if those need to be used for outdoor dining or just for indoor service.
Sure. So the need for servers to use a face shield as well as a mask is for indoor dining. And your folks, and we saw this on site in the field, okay, where oftentimes servers, the masks fall behind, under the nose and everything else. And it's an extra layer of protection for your staff and your wait staff, because the patrons that are sitting in an indoor environment where there are ventilation issues, potential ventilation issues, are not going to be masked. They're going to be eating and drinking. And the potential for your employees to end up getting COVID ends up being at a higher risk.
And to that point, Palak, if is it only employees that are face fronting with the guests? So do the cooks or anything have to use both, or do the same rules, a face shield or a mask, one or the other, apply for those in back of the house?
In back of the house, it's just one or the other. The face shields are just for your folks that are going to be dealing directly with your patrons that are, sitting and eating and don't have their mask on.
Thank you. There's a question of how do barriers affect the fire code requirements?
I don't understand that question. The barriers are...
I don't know if I do either.
I'm sorry, the barriers are only to be used. They're the short barriers that I'm sure everybody has seen if they've gone to a retail food store, whether it's a supermarket or 7-Eleven, Wawa. There's a barrier at the checkout register. If you're speaking of barriers that are present because you don't have enough space to socially distance tables, as long as they're short enough and tall enough to protect people that are sitting as well as standing, then we're not asking you to create barriers that are going to cause people to be stuck in the building or something like that. If there's a specific example from the proprietor, we can offline entertain that and talk that through.
And just to clarify, if the tables are 6 feet apart, they do not need a barrier, correct?
Correct. Absolutely correct.
I think we answered we got through a lot of the face shield questions. Here's one that even I know the answer to, but we'll ask you. Can patrons sit at a bar and eat a meal?
No, right now they cannot. The rules are pretty specific about bars. We are trying to be innovative and think about, if there's a way to put a barrier partition in between people sitting at a bar. Is there a way to socially distance people? So if people have ideas about that, please share them. Innovation, okay?
And to Palak's point, the lack of bar seating or service is actually a statewide mandate right now. So Philadelphia couldn't change it even if they wanted to.
Exactly.
There's a question of what metrics are being used to determine when restaurants can increase capacity.
So the metrics that are being used would be at the governor's office as well as the health commissioner. The capacity that is being allowed for indoors mirrors what the capacity is for the state. So, those are the questions. I believe the metrics are based on number of cases and other things, but I'm not privy to that. I would refer you all to, ask those questions of Dr. Levine and or the health commissioner's office.
Thank you. Can you go over, Palak, once again, the accountability or the enforcement that will be happening if a business is not following the guidelines?
Absolutely. So if a business is not following the guidelines, our first step is going to be to do education. We want to give the opportunity to correct things on site, which is what we've been doing all along. The challenge becomes when folks don't want to cooperate and don't want to correct things on site, or they are refusing inspection, or they are just in gross violation and they've been given warnings and given the opportunity and they have not corrected it. That may lead to either a voluntary closure or a cease operation.
Thank you. I have a few clarifying questions, Palak, that I'm going to try and bundle into a few questions. One, 25% capacity is technically inclusive of staff as well. Does that include back of the house staff, or does the 25% only include the staff that is forward facing with the customer?
Forward facing.
Okay, that's the answer we wanted. There is some question again on private events. If a restaurant has a private event, for, let's say, wedding rehearsal, are they subject to the 25-person limit, or could they use their 25% capacity?
If it's a restaurant, it is the 25% capacity, okay, but the same rules for social distancing and all of that apply. We get concerned, the specific concerns are for private events is that unlike people seated at a group of 4 people seated at a table and then finishing their meal and walking away, gatherings, people will mingle with each other, and more likely if they're eating and drinking, they're not going to be masked, and those are the concerns, and we've had pockets of COVID outbreaks, and so we want to make sure that things are designed in a way that you're not going to, you know, decide having the wedding and get COVID.
And to actually Palik's point, the state does restrict events at 25. So if it is probably a private event, you're probably subject to the state 25-person minimum. So that's something we'll want to look into. Are there any restrictions on dance floors, or do people need to be seated at all times in Philadelphia?
They need to be seated. There again, you want to be mindful of mingling, and you know, dance floors are not something that you should be designing for the events.
Thank you. All right, are lunch counters allowed to be open?
So right now, given the fact that there's no counter seating, that would be, you know, if the question becomes for your lunch counter, you know, what, how are you going to socially distance and what are you going to do? And that could be something that if folks have a particular counter space in mind and they want to share that with us, I'd be happy to kind of look at it and ask for further guidance.
Excuse me, can I just interrupt really quick? Palik, it sounds like your microphone might be rubbing up against something. We keep getting some noise. I don't know if you have the ability to move your mic if it's not rubbing up against you or something else. If you can, every once in a while we just get some noise. I just wanted you to be aware of it.
Okay, is that better?
That sounds great.
You are crisp.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Sorry about that.
The Department of Health, you're fine. The Department of Health has guidelines regarding HVAC functionality, room turnover rate, feet of ductwork, register blockage, etc. Does the city have recommended techs to look at this stuff? Most chefs, restaurateurs are not HVAC experts, and many HVAC companies are crooks.
All I can tell you is, as regulators, we don't have any recommendations, nor would we make any recommendations. So I would suggest if you have an HVAC system, more than likely you have a company that comes, hopefully that comes and services it. So I would suggest that you start with them.
Let's see, there was a question about sick leave policies in place. For those of you that are under 500 employees, you are covered by Families First. If God forbid one of your employees does contract COVID. But I would believe, Palik, that since Philadelphia does require sick leave, that would be a sick leave policy that would be available to employees. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe so. But again, I'm not the expert on that, but I believe so, yes.
We have another one, which I think we need clarification on, but there's a question of, can a family of 6 or 8 or 10 be sat at a single table in a private room? So in that scenario, it would likely be a private event.
As long, I believe so, if it's just the family. Okay. No, but again, these are kind of case by case situations. So if someone has a specific question associated with that, we can always follow up as well. But if it's just a family of 8 in a private room by themselves sitting, you know.
Yeah, and to back Palik up on that, I mean, I think the city is really following a lot of the state guidelines on this. So for public facing your regular dining room, the city is saying 4 people to a table. Private events, you do have your 25-person cap. And with that, you need to have social distancing between tables. But if it's a private event, the rules are slightly different, but you're also capped at no more than 25 people. There's a question regarding clarification on barriers at the Hostess, Cashier, and pickup areas.
The question being that you should have a barrier if the public can walk up.
So could they, and this is me trying to see if I can dig in a little deeper. Some places around the state will put up a table to encourage the 6 feet social distancing to keep people from walking right up. Would that be permissible? Would some type of separation be permissible?
Yes, ma'am.
Or does it have to be an actual barrier?
No, it can be because a lot of the outdoor dining establishments with the wind and all were having an issue. So that can be permissible. Yes, we would just want to assess it while we're doing our normal inspection.
And then for face shields, is the goal to provide coverage for mouth or also to cover eyes like goggles? Are there specific things that you're looking for in that scenario for the face shields?
Definitely the eyes as well as the mouth and nose, which are protected by the mask. And the reason being, if there are patrons sitting there eating and drinking and they start talking and things like that, there's, more of a chance for exposure through the eyes.
Thank you. Does the 11 p.m. closure rule also apply to private events like a wedding?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, let's see.
And just to clarify, I'm sorry, the 11 p.m., that's kind of the last call for meal and alcohol. It's up to midnight that you can go, and then by 12:30, the establishment has to be closed up.
And to clarify another question, Palak, I think you're updating the guidance to reflect this. If an entity currently has outdoor space that they are operating until, let's say, 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, on September 8th, does their closing time change to that 11 p.m. last call, midnight closing?
Yes, it would. And if they have a specific reason why they need to go longer than that, then we can follow up, and that decision will be based on, complaints and other challenges. And so we'll look at all of that.
Okay, and then this is I'm getting text messages and emails, messages on the chat to clarify the health check that you're encouraging restaurants to do to guests before they enter. Is it permissible for them to post a sign on the door that says if you're showing any of these symptoms, you're encouraged not to enter, or do they have to physically ask every single guest if they're showing symptoms?
So you could definitely post up a sign, but you should ask these questions when you're taking any sort of reservations. And if you're just allowing folks to sit in, again, all of this is to protect, protect the patron, the restaurant, because if a case of COVID is traced back to a food establishment, which the COVID unit division of the health department is doing a lot of trace back. And we've had instances where there are specific establishments that are being linked to COVID infections. And so this is really to protect yourself and to protect the staff. And because there are people that either are asymptomatic or, to be frank, don't care, and they'll show up to eat because they want to eat.
That's very, very good point. We have a question of, are patrons required to wear masks if they're in an eating space or a meeting place and they're not eating? So if they're in a private function space in a hotel, do they need to wear their masks since they're not eating?
Yes, absolutely. The only time they should not be wearing a mask is if they're actively engaged in eating and drinking.
And this is a question that probably also has been applying forever, but maybe you can re-clarify. For back of the house staff, if they can be 6 feet apart and it's uncomfortable for them to wear a shield or a mask, can they not wear a shield or a mask if they're 6 feet apart?
It depends on how long they're going to not have contact with anybody. So case in point, if you are at your workspace and you are at your office, and at your desk, you're taking your mask off, okay, to work. But the moment you leave that space or interact with anybody, the mask has to go on.
Then there's a question, with if there are no bar guests allowed, would a bartender be considered back of the house or front of the house in terms of figuring occupancy counts?
So if the bartender is not routinely dealing with the customers, then they'd be considered back of the house.
Thank you. I think we've answered private events outdoor. Last call is 11 p.m. universally. The guidance will be updated, so you don't have to answer that one again, Palak. Are booths back to back considered a barrier?
No,
And then
they
to
would
that
need to
end,
have a barrier.
And what is the height of the barrier that would be needed between tables or booths?
So the height of the barrier would have to be tall enough so that it has to be from the distance where if I was sitting and I couldn't cough or sneeze on the person next to me, so there shouldn't be any space underneath, and it should be tall enough for tall guests, so upwards of 6 feet up, okay? A lot of folks are using what looks like clear plastic shower curtain material to drape the barrier from the ceiling down to the booth edge, and that's fine.
Thank you. Just to reiterate this, I do know we've gotten a few questions about open kitchens and the need for barriers there. If the open kitchen is more than 6 feet from the guest, would an open kitchen need to have a barrier up?
No, they should not.
Thank you. I think we answered this. I'll reiterate it again so Palak can take a sip of water. 25% includes front of the house, guest-facing staff, and patrons.
Correct.
And then 6 feet is measured from the table edge or the chair back in terms of distancing.
I would say chair back, because if someone, you just want to be, mindful that someone is not sitting too far back and they're then butted up against the next table, chair back.
Okay. I'm not sure if I understand this next question. I guess there's your thoughts on having a server settle a customer bill instead of a cashier. You could skip an extra step and maybe an extra person if you have a server handle. Is that something that would make sense for businesses to consider?
I mean, absolutely. Or they can have the cashier on staff, but consider them back of the house because they're not directly dealing with the patrons.
And we did have a question, and I can answer this one. Guests not cooperating. PRLA did a webinar, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, about de-escalation and how to handle guests that are being difficult. So I urge you to go on our website and look at our past webinars. We did do a webinar on that specific scenario. Are restaurants like a Brazilian steakhouse allowed to bring meat to be carved at the tables?
It all depends on the way that they're going to set it up and the PPEs and all of that. So we would want to evaluate that as a one-off.
Thank you. Could goggles or glasses count as a face shield in combination with the mask?
That's a good question. I'll have to honestly get back to you.
That is a good question. Thank you. Thank you for asking that, Jessica. Let's see. Any questions about disability, short-term disability or paid sick leave? That's not a PALIC question. So we're happy to get some of those answers from other city departments. Let's see. For private events, do the tables have to be socially distanced at 6 feet? They actually have to be at the state level. So I assume they also have to be at the city level, correct, PALIC?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Let's see. Every time I think we're getting near the end, we get more. If your space has more than one private room, does this mean each room maxes out at 25 guests, including front of the house staff? So could they have, let's say they have 3 meeting spaces, and could they do 3 private events with 25 guests, including front of the house?
I will have to honestly get back to you on that, because the other concern becomes, how are you going to mitigate do each of those rooms have their own private toileting facilities? And those sorts of questions. So I can get back to you.
And do you see in the future, do you think there's any talk of enforcing temperature logs or anything for employees or guests and requiring temperature checks outside of what's already required if somebody does test positive in a business?
If I could look into the future, I would say that it's good to you know, be mindful of keeping track of your patrons and who is there, just from a contact tracing perspective. But again, that would be a question potentially to ask our COVID division.
Yep. And then just to clarify, are hotels basically under the same food and beverage rules and regulations as restaurants?
Yes.
In terms of food and beverage service? Thank you.
Yep.
Let's see.
And there are guidelines about hotels that are already listed on the website. So, you know, I would encourage folks to also look at those.
We're getting a number of questions about 25%. And to be honest, I think Philadelphia, outside of 4 people per table, is pretty well aligned with the state on that front. So I would encourage you to take a look at the state guidance as well if you want some more clarification, because I do think in that scenario, there is a difference between 25% is if the public is coming in. If Palak and I are friends and we're going out to dinner and your restaurant's open to the public, that's 25%. If I am getting married and I want to have a rehearsal dinner with my family and that's 12 people, that's a discrete private event, of which would be in a private room and has to be less than 25. So I think the city's pretty well aligned with that, but if there's changes, I'm sure we'll find out.
Exactly. No, you're absolutely correct.
Palak, is the guidance pertaining to some updates to the city's website, is that going to be, do you have an idea of when that will be updated?
I believe it was already updated. But if folks are not, it looks very similar to the existing guidance. There were just sections added to it. So if there's an issue with, you know, being able to access it or what have you, Melissa, we can follow up in the back, you know, in the background.
I think, yeah, I think we were waiting for the 11 p.m. update on the guidance, and then potentially, and this actually leads to the next question, the 50-person max rule, which I think has given you and I a headache more than any other over the past few weeks. Does that 50-person max continue to apply for indoor and outdoor dining, or does the 20, so if you can serve 30 people in your outdoor dining and 30 people indoor, are you allowed to do so, or does the 50-person cap still apply in that scenario?
No, you're allowed to do so because we're moving into indoor. So you can still, you know, do the 50 people outside if you are appropriately approved for the streetery, the sidewalk, cafe, or what have you. And then there was an application for those folks that have an extension outside, you know, that have enough space outside to extend something.
Thank you. And then, Palak, I know we don't know the answer to this, but I think if you could just make a note to see if there's any more HVAC recommendations that restaurants could look into or hotels could look into. I think that might be helpful for those that are interested in making sure they're going above and beyond in that space.
Sure.
Thank you. How many people are allowed at an outdoor event if you have a tent that can occupy 200 people?
So outdoor events are not permitted, remember, until February. If you're talking about a catering type of event, not like a special event, and what we've been doing with those is that right now they're capped at 50. And if there's a reason for an increase request, then normally folks will ask for that via email using our form, and then I usually reach out to the commissioner and ask for guidance, or the deputy commissioner and or the chief of staff for the department.
Thank you. We have a question. If a customer comes up to order or pay at a counter and the cashier is wearing a face shield, is there still a need for a barrier at that register?
As long as if the cashier is wearing a face shield and a mask, no.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, commentary is always appreciated. I just don't need to read it out loud. There's somebody did ask about 250 maximum outside. That is for the rest of the state. Philadelphia is at 50 for outside. Allegheny is at 100. 250 is for the other counties not under Philadelphia's jurisdiction. And I think we've had a few questions of when people think that the capacity limits will be increased. I mean, I'll speak for PALIC as well as for myself. The day I can get in the governor or Commissioner Farley's head will be a day that I know all of the answers. So we'll know about the same time all of you know.
Yeah, and I mean, these things are really based on case counts and caseloads and, you know, keeping track. And so you all are aware, we've been doing a lot of, for the past almost 3.5 weeks, we've done a lot of enforcement activity in the evenings on weekends for places that we've gotten a multitude of complaints, including videos of activities going on without masks, without social distancing in the evenings and on weekends. And we've had to really go ahead and do some enforcement with that, because despite all of the rules and requirements, there are a handful of folks that are just doing whatever they feel like doing, and it's really impacting all the rest of us. Because when you have a situation or a scenario where folks that are supposed to just do takeout or delivery, you know, food and alcoholic beverages, and then they muster around and they sit around the establishment and don't leave, and they're not masked, and you have crowds of, you know, 100 people just sitting on, and Philadelphia, you know, a lot of our eateries are nestled within residential areas, and everybody's just sitting there and there's no masking. I mean, inevitably leads to more cases, and then it impacts all of us negatively that are trying to get things open and operating and get things back to some level of normalcy.
Thank you. And we've gotten a few more questions, and I'll reiterate, PALIC is going to double check that. If it is a family that's greater than 4, she is going to double check and see if you can sit a party that's greater than 4 if they are part of a family. So that one, I know she will get us the answer on. Let's see. There is another question about bars, which I know the answer is no, but we'll let you, I'll read it out loud. If a location has 2 bars, can they designate one is for service manned by a bartender and the other is not serving staffed and then be used for seating, assuming those bar seats are set 6 feet apart or with barriers, effectively creating a table, but at a bar countertop?
We would really need to look at some pictures and description of that process, and then do an assessment in the field of that.
Thank you. There is, of course, some of these questions I know are questions for Commissioner Farley regarding widespread testing and contact tracing. None of those are really under PALIC's purview. She is just the one making sure that you are following the guidance that the commissioner has put out there. So for some of those questions, the HVAC questions, those are questions for the health commissioner himself that PALIC is not able to answer today. So I do want to reiterate that. I know we've had a few questions on that front.
And in all honesty, Melissa, I'm taking notes and I will follow up with the questions. And if you email me the specific questions, you know, I will follow up and ask those.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
Same with, and I think, and I don't know, Palik, if you want to speak to this, I think that there is concern of front of the house employees being scared to work. To be honest, that's a decision I would say would be based on you as a business owner. If you're not comfortable reopening indoors, this is not a mandate that you open indoors. So it's really up to you and your staff working together to decide if it's something that you're comfortable with. And I don't know if you have anything to add on that front, Palik, and we can work, like I said, on getting more contact tracing and all of that. But do you have any recommendations for those whose front of the house staff are just not comfortable working indoors?
I mean, not necessarily as someone that's responsible and has a staff of about, 120 people that I'm responsible for. The best thing that you can do, we've had open dialogues with the staff and addressing their concerns, making sure that there's adequate PPE available for them, and just, we've been fielding, we've been doing inspections throughout all of this. And so just fielding those concerns and being flexible and open enough to make changes as needed, and to make sure that, we can go ahead and make the staff feel comfortable and safe enough to work in the environment.
Thank you. There is a question about cocktails to go. They are not impacted because the city, cocktails to go, the state law requires you to stop selling them at 11 p.m. So that's unchanged by these regulations. And I did get a question about this, and I'll ask Palik if this will work. We've talked about doing this before, but I think it's working out a lot better now. We will put together, PRLA will put together kind of an FAQ from this webinar. And Palik, I know, will work on getting some of those additional clarifications. And then I will send the FAQ, Palik, if that's okay to you, for you to take a look at and make sure we got all the right answers. And we will then share that with everybody. Is that sound okay to you, Palik?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And again, like I said, we are going to look to get more clarification. The fact that Palik knows everything she knows as it is great, but she can't answer all the questions that she doesn't know the answers to. Are tables allowed to be pushed up to the bar?
Again, that's going to be a case-by-case scenario to see, we are committed to working with you to help you maximize what you need to maximize for your business.
Thank you. Palik, there, relating to some of those follow-up questions for the commissioner, do you want to share your email address, or is it easier for them to call the Department of Public Health and then call the phone number? What would you suggest for people who have these questions about contact tracing and food and safety?
So if it's contact tracing and medically related questions, you would definitely want to reach out to the commissioner's office. There's a whole contact tracing. There's a whole unit for COVID contact tracing and containment. And you would want to go ahead and reach out to that number. You can always also start with the main number for the commissioner's office, which is the 215-686-5200 number. And they can connect you with the COVID contact unit. I apologize, I don't know, the COVID division is pretty new, so I'm not familiar with their phone number off the top of my head. If it's specific to your food establishment, or you have questions regarding the things that Environmental Health Services regulates, you can call the number that's on the screen still. And, my staff will find me wherever I am in the field. If there are specific questions that you'd rather address via email, you can either email Melissa, or Melissa can share my email address, and we can follow up.
Thank you. And to that end, we will include that contact information in that document that we will put together as well. And I know some people are frustrated, but I can't answer questions that I'm not versed in, and I know Palik can't either. So I know you're frustrated. This just isn't, Palik's not the person to answer it all right now. So I appreciate that. We will get you answers, but I don't know them, and neither does Palik at this point. There is a question on state law regarding cocktails to go. The thought was that they would end as indoor dining resumed. Fun fact, whoever wrote that law, I think that she's brilliant, maybe because it was my friend and I, but cocktails to go are permitted statewide until you hit 60% capacity. So cocktails to go can continue under state law until you are above 60% capacity.
Yep.
There's a question for the, and this probably isn't a Palak question, but I'll ask. Palak, for hotels, can they sell beverages to go until 2 a.m. for people to take back to their rooms in the hotel, since that would fall under a different law than cocktails to go?
I will have to, we'll have to ask that question and get back to you.
Okay. For establishments that are applying with the health department, I'm not sure if anybody needs to apply to the health department, so I'm not sure if I understand this question. Asking if they're applying to the health department, should they include the socially distanced layouts on our plans, not knowing when changes will happen? Should we include the barriers as well? I don't know if that makes sense to you, Palak. That one confused me a little bit.
I'm not sure. I mean, the indoor dining is permissible starting the 2nd. I mean, sorry, the 8th. I apologize. Starting Tuesday. You know, you don't need to apply for anything in particular for us or to us to go ahead and do that. The only things that you would need to reach out is if you're doing outdoor dining for more than 50 people, you can reach out and ask. If you have a specific question about whether or not something's permissible, you can do that. But, you know, effective on September 8th, indoor dining is permissible. And, you know, definitely look at the YouTube video, look at the presentation that we did of do's and don'ts, and just set up your establishment and move accordingly. There will be folks coming out to do kind of education and outreach. And then, you know, we'll be folding all of these things into our normal inspections.
And it does look like that was a question for a new establishment. So to Palak's point, if you're operating brand new and you're applying for your normal business licenses, you don't need to include it. But if you are applying for an outdoor extension, that is a requirement. And then last question, because we are at 2 o'clock, are hookahs allowed indoor or outdoor?
Okay, great question. So hookahs are not allowed outdoor because of if you are doing hookah, you need a state cigarette license, you need a tobacco permit from the city of Philadelphia to sell those products. In order to allow hookah smoke inside, you need a special exemption for smoking. Okay, those exemptions, the requirement for applying for those exemptions expired in 2007. There are certain ways in which you can apply for hookah, and there's a process involved, but that if you have an existing approval to do hookah indoors, then come the 8th, you'll be able to do that, provided that there's adequate social distancing. And with hookah, there's additional you know, things that you need to keep in mind as far as sanitization and folks sharing mouthpieces and sharing the hoses, and how are you going to adequately clean the inside of the hose. While people may not share the same mouth or tip piece, each person may have their own. How are you going to, you know, this is a respiratory disease. How are you going to keep those hoses clean? And, you know, if there's an impact of virus going into the hose, what is going to be your process for keeping everything clean and disinfected?
Thank you. And that was a out there question. So it was a good one to end on. We're at an hour in. Palak, thank you again for taking the time to answer questions running the entire gauntlet. So really appreciate your help here. For those of you that are on the call, as I mentioned, PRLA will put together an FAQ that we will run by Palak to make sure that we got all of the right answers that we can share with all of you. And for those of you that didn't get the answers you were looking for today because we don't have them or don't know them or we're not the right person, we will get those answers for you. It's not a fact of ignoring your questions and concerns. It's just that we aren't the right people to answer those right now. So
Yep.
with that.
And I'll
Go
just
ahead,
say,
Halleck.
Melissa and everybody, thank you so much for the opportunity. We are committed to working with you, and I mean that. And I hope folks have felt that support during the outdoor dining process, and we're going to continue to move through these times and work together.
Thank you, everyone. Stay safe. We'll be in touch.
Take care. Bye-bye.